Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something on the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the conversations here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you or somebody you know would like to come on the show and have a conversation with me, be sure to reach out to me on social media. The best way to do that is isaacl.dev. That'll give you the links to all of my other places that I'm hanging out on the internet. And I look forward to hearing from you. So with that, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. This is a good friend of mine. We see each other a few times a year when we're at conferences or if they come over to MVP Summit. And let's just get into it. So my guest today, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Nice to be here. I'm actually happy that you pronounced my last name correctly.
Oh,
I had a discussion at the MVP Summit last week, like how you're supposed to pronounce it, and it feels correct. It's actually Doomen, but in English it's Doomen. It completely makes sense to me. Who I am? I'm a software developer slash consultant. Been doing that for 28 years, 29 years now, I think. I've been speaking at a couple of conferences where I saw you, Isaac, a couple of times, which was every time a situation that I would remember because we always have fun, we always laugh, and sometimes some beer involved. For the rest, yeah, I have a couple of open source projects. Some of them are, I would say, well known, maybe notorious by now, but still. And I try to use every opportunity I can to be able to share my experiences. I love my job. I love the technology. I'm very passionate about it, and I remain to it. I'm 51 now. I thought at some point it will die down, but no, it just increases. I love my job. That's what it is.
yeah, no, and it's great to chat with you, and I'm looking forward to like you and I. We whenever we see each other, we end up just sitting and chatting for a long time. But it'll be good to know a little bit of your backstory and what kind of it fascinates you about technology. And how I like to do that with my guests is I like to ask them how it got started. Do you remember when technology like first introduced itself to you? Like for instance, like were you one of those folks that got like the CDs in the mail with the code magazines and you would type, or maybe a little bit later, like young, like maybe university? Like when did technology introduce itself to you?
Well, when I started doing that, there were no
Sure,
CDs.
sure,
There were floppy
sure.
drives. Um, I think, if I remember correctly, when I was 11, 10 or 11, I actually got a Commodore 64 from my grandmother. And that's kind of when it started. I mean, I also love music. So I was usually playing demos on my Commodore 64, music demos and stuff like that. I started programming in BASIC and at some point in Simon's BASIC. And I don't actually understand where it's coming from. My father has a similar interest for technology, but also electronics. So he's done a lot of electronics in his career. But yeah, obviously there were no computers when he was young. And for me, it all started in that period. I guess after that, I got an Amiga, a Commodore Amiga. Maybe some people remember that, where I started to learn programming in C, later on in C++. And I guess it's the fact that you can actually create things.
Yeah.
The fact that you can create things in a creative way. When I was younger, I did a lot of Legos. I still actually do it. Now I'm old and I'm doing Lego again because now I can afford it. But yeah, I love creating things, but it needs to have
Yeah.
purpose.
Yeah, that no, I that's interesting. And thank you for correcting me about how old you are. Um, so one of the things that you mentioned the Lego thing, it's funny because I think a lot of young kids like they get into Lego and there's like this gap where, you know, you're busy doing other things and then like you said, you have a little bit of money, Lego sets are expensive, and you still kind of have that tinkerer, that like that builder sort of passion about you, so you do it. And now it's one of the, at least with me, it's now I do it with my kids, and where I do 99% of the work and my kid sits there and watches me, but my kid is involved and it's cool. It's funny, like, because it seems like with me, with Lego specifically, like I just want to put it together and then look at it like it's a piece of art, when that's really not the real purpose, I think, of Lego. At least when I was younger, it was you build whatever you want and there's creativity involved. So, were you that person, or when you were younger, you would just build whatever, or were you kind of I want to build the sets and I want to look at them, like kind of like how I am now?
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, because when I was young, I was very creative. I would build all kinds of stuff. Now I love building the thing that comes out of the box and I put it on the shelf or something like that. But when coding, it's different. Like I don't actually enjoy building something for myself. I only like to build things that are actually useful. Like I don't start, I don't know, try .NET Aspire and do something with it. I actually need to do it with a purpose, like for my client, or because I'm building it as a way to expose something to the community, like an open source project. I wanted it to be used. I don't want to build something that nobody cares
Sure,
about.
sure, that's fair. Yeah,
That
yeah,
makes
no,
sense.
it
Yeah.
is, it is. And that kind of transitions into technology. So like, when did you realize there was money to be made and you can like have a career with technology?
That's a good question. Honestly, I don't remember. At some point, I decided to start studying electronics
Okay,
because I thought like there was also the computer engineering, like the programming part, IT part, which felt like it was a bit theoretical. So I started with like technical, like it's called, I think, electronic engineering or something. But throughout that course, I also attended some sessions or lectures about compilers and stuff like that. And that's when I realized, okay, that's what I want to do myself. And then gradually, after graduating, I started working for a company where I started to do a bit of coding. I still was coding at home, but only I think when I was working for 2, 3 years, it really dawned on me that this is the thing I want to do. And it was actually pretty difficult to find a job where I can completely focus on programming because a lot of companies, and there were not a lot of jobs at that time in the Netherlands, felt like I didn't have the experience, so they didn't give me the chance to do it until one of them did. And then I discovered that actually I could do this. I was actually, I would say, pretty okay with it.
pretty okay.
And that's when it worked.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, pretty okay. Do you remember the first like thing you built? Like the first program you built?
Like ever?
Yeah, like ever.
Yeah, no. Yeah, well, yes, I do actually. I created do you remember Soundtracker? Is that something
No,
that you
no.
remember or are you too young for that? Soundtracker was a tool that you could use to create music at like three channels and
Okay.
stuff. And I tried to build something similar on my Commodore 64. I don't remember if I finished it. And then on Amiga, and that's actually, if you would look down, if you would actually search for my name and Amiga, you'll find my first open source tool, which is, I didn't look at it. You just reminded me of it. I can probably do that. Maybe it's still there somewhere. I created something and it's so long ago, maybe it's just gone from the internet.
Maybe.
But yeah, that was actually the first time I actually put something on public
Yeah,
domain. I think it was called
yeah.
like that. That old.
So like that's kind of like your first introduction into like open source too, right? So like when did you realize that there's all these people out there that are making things and they're sharing with the community, maybe they're building it for themselves and they're sharing it out. Like when did that become a thing too? Because at least for me, I always knew that people were out building stuff, but like it didn't really like introduce itself to me or show up in my brain until I was a lot like further in my career. Like that, oh, like people actually like they spend a lot of their time like building things for everybody else to use. So like when was open source introduced itself to you?
I think pretty late because if I remember correctly, I started creating Fluid Assertion somewhere in 2011. And at that time, there was nothing but Codeplex. Yeah, you had Code Project, which contains some stuff, Codeplex, but there was, I don't think NuGet existed at that time. If that's, how do you actually pronounce
Nougat?
that?
Yeah, you pronounce it right,
Good.
Nougat. Yeah.
NuGet, yeah, correct. I don't think it existed yet because I remember that we were still on Codeplex and it was pretty hard to expose components to people. Maybe it was just a zip file or something. I don't exactly remember. But this whole open source community, that came much later, much later. Probably around the time that alt.net became a thing. That's when I started to realize that, like I was using an Hibernate, a structure map from Jeremy G. Miller, stuff like that. I feel like that's when I really started to realize that there's an open source
Yeah.
world.
And you've been in like in the so your entire professional career for the most part you've been like building in like the Microsoft ecosystem, right? So like around .NET, right? Yeah.
Mhm.
So I would love to get your thoughts as somebody who has seen .NET go through this evolution of like, being, very much for enterprise only, for, closed source, and now to what it is now. Like, you were just at the MVP summit and people are talking about, everything's on GitHub, building these crazy subs of applications that, are, hundreds of microservices and all these things. And like, it's very antithesis to like what like a lot of people think of what .NET is and like the original purpose of .NET. So like, what is your like general feeling of like the evolution of like when it was when you first got started to what it is today?
Yeah, there's definitely a difference. And obviously, when I started, I did Windows Forms, stuff like that, which I started. This is actually what I did when I started using .NET, like, I don't know, 24 years ago or something like that. And it was also Windows only. And I guess the whole transition to .NET Standard and then .NET Core changed the world. For now I would say there's no reason to not use
Yeah.
.NET because it's such a mature platform. C# is a beautiful language. For me, that's completely obvious that I would use it everywhere I can. I'm not yet convinced that I should use it on the front end. I've been involved in a lot of projects where we used TypeScript, TypeScript with React or TypeScript with Vue.js, which worked really well. I would not recommend anybody to do, vanilla JavaScript anymore. That's just hurting yourself. And I have also not convinced about Maui. I actually did Silverlight. I built a production system with Silverlight, which was beautiful. There was even an open source project. I forgot his name, created by Rob
Rob
something.
Eisenberg.
Anyway, um,
Yeah.
yes, Rob Eisenberg, which was beautiful. But now there's no reason. You can use it everywhere. I mean, and we have good IDEs now that we can be used everywhere on all platforms. I can't imagine why you'll use anything. And I've recently looked at Java because some client was using it, and I was a bit disappointed how far behind it is compared to C sharp. The language just gets better and better, and it's just incredible what we have these days.
Yeah.
And then we have
Yeah, no,
TypeScript. Yeah,
it is pretty fascinating how like I've had this conversation a few times where I write a good amount of JavaScript for miscellaneous things, or maybe I'll write a Python thing here or there. But I always end up going back to .NET because one, it's the language that I'm most comfortable with, so I kind of try to solve every problem with that. But also it's like I can't really be convinced otherwise for a lot of the things that I built why I wouldn't use .NET. That's not to say that there are some use cases where I think .NET isn't as great an option as some other languages, but like I see .NET as being very utility as it pertains to like languages. It's not very super specialized like some other languages, and it gives you a lot of flexibility to build different things for different kinds of apps, different kinds of devices, so on and so forth, right?
true. And the community is also pretty strong. But to be fair, I might also be naive. I mean, I've never done any Go or Rust or Kotlin or
Yeah,
anything like that. Maybe those languages are much better suited for, I don't know, for certain situations. But you have to also be realistic. I'm a consultant. I work with clients. They need to use certain technology. I remember that I was working with a client and some external consultant came in, kept saying, you know what, F sharp, it's much better, it's much better. And it
sure,
looked pretty good. But the problem in the end was, yeah, there was nobody to support that. So they had to rip it out and go back to C sharp. I mean, with ChatGPT and tools like that, it's going to be much easier to switch back and forth. But yeah, the language of choice is also a matter of experience and what kind of people you
sure.
have in your company. On the other hand, if a company is building backend and front end in JavaScript, I would seriously reconsider that and try to move them in a certain direction because the NPM world is really a
Yeah, no,
madness.
it becomes hard, and I think what this is one of the, in my opinions, one of the things that's very challenging about open source is that, everybody has opinions. So you'll have people that build the same sort of thing over and over and over again, but it's all different opinions. And I think that's great.
True.
But at the same time, it's if you're trying to be a consumer of open source and you want to like, okay, I want to do some like a logging framework. Let's just use that. It's like, oh, I'm gonna like, what logging framework do I use? There's tons of them out there, right? And so the only way really for me to see if it works for me is I have to get the code, I have to get the NuGet package or the npm package or whatever. I have to like put it into my app. I have to see if it does what I want, and if that can take a few hours or even a few days, depending on how complex it is. And then I decide whether or not to use it. And if I decide not to use it, it's a lot
Hmm.
of work. I got to rip it all out and I got to put something else in, and it's a lot of cyclic churn. And that's what, and also because you're depending on the work of somebody else, and we'll talk about this in a bit, like, you know, what if that maintainer wants to not work on that project anymore?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that happens.
Yeah. They
Happens
hit
a
the
lot
lottery.
actually.
They move on to
Yeah,
like they're writing different programming language. Maybe they don't even write in C sharp or TypeScript anymore, right? Like why would I continue to
yeah.
do this work? So it's very challenging as a consumer. So I understand why some people get very uh uncomfortable when things move in this space, but it's like you have to remember that everybody like it's free work and people are doing it for a reason. And if that reason may change, it's okay. But it is very challenging.
That's also what I tell. Like usually, I'm a consultant, and as an architect, I join a client. Why I often tell them, like, okay, folks, open source is not free. You know, you may not have to pay for it, but you have to really think about the consequences um, of, like, exactly as you described. So one of the things I typically tell them is, if you use certain open source, of course, you need to look at certain licenses because some of the licenses might be painful, but also like what's behind that project? What happens if that project gets abandoned? Is it a one person project? Is there an entire community behind that? So if one of them will stop, then the rest can take it over. And if it's not a big community, what's the quality of the code? Because if somebody stops working on it and you still rely on it, then it actually means that you have to take that code and have your teams
Yeah.
start maintaining it until you can replace it with something else. That is a responsibility that a lot of companies don't realize. Um, so yeah, usually we also look at the code. We look at the branching strategy. We look at like what kind of issues are created, what .NET versions are supported. That gives us a sense of confidence whether it's actually a safe thing to use. Also depends whether it's used in the build pipeline or it's actually used in the production code that you ship to clients or put on the internet. There's a big difference as well, of course. So yeah, what I'm trying to say is that it's not free per
Yeah, no,
se. If you use something, you need to take that
yeah, no, I
responsibility.
completely agree. It's also one of those things too where it helps you as a consumer because then you kind of understand how it works. And I think one of the things that we as
Yeah,
consumers of tech in general make mistakes on over and over again is just assuming that what we're using is going to be safe, it's going to work, it's going to whatever, right? And I have these thoughts too. Is like we get more and more like comfortable with using like AI based chat assistants or AI based coding assistants. It's like, are we trusting every single thing that we see as the right answer without really doing our due diligence to understand as to the why, right? And that's the same thing with yeah,
same thing here. But the same thing. You're using code from the internet,
yeah,
wherever it's coming from. Either you need to be prepared to actually understand that code. Like example, I'm building a new open source project to scan your NuGet packages for certain licenses, or being able to whitelist or blacklist certain packages. I've never done that. So I started actually programming, and at some point I have to get some license information from GitHub for a NuGet package. I have never done that. Turns out there's already open source package they can use to connect to NuGet, even Microsoft support. Sometimes Copilot just, dumped an entire implementation that did
yeah,
exactly that. And for me, that's cool. That saves me a lot of searching, but I still just, take the responsibility
yeah,
understanding that code, checking line by line. What does this line of code do? Does it perform well? I'm checking out the documentation. If there's no documentation, I'm going to dive like, where's this coming from? So even though AI tools give me a lot of, productivity, saves me a lot of time from searching things. I mean, you were mentioning logging frameworks. I would probably use ChatGPT or Cloud or something like that to say, like, give me comparison of the logging
yeah,
frameworks. Like, what are the strengths and weaknesses? This is something you couldn't do in the
sure.
past. Now you can. So even if you use code that is generated by your AI tool, you still have to respond. It's your code. It's going to be your code. You have to maintain it. You have to make sure it upholds all the levels that you usually expect. So it doesn't matter for me whether I wrote it myself or it came from the tool. I don't know how we got that, by the way. I
No,
think
no,
we had
I
to
mean
really go
we're
a bit
very much
deeper.
on topic. And I think one of the things that's interesting to me is like you mentioned like a little bit ago about how you're a consultant and like you work for other companies that are trying to implement solutions instead of kind of like working for, you're building a product for a customer or for a company or you're, an engineer at a company or whatever. You're like you're working for a customer trying to help them like move their IT organization forward, right? So, I'm
Yeah,
genuinely curious, as I've been a consultant before, and I think one of the challenges that you always run into is what is what is and what is not like in the comfort zone of the customer, of the client. And I'd like to get your thoughts as to like how do you go about helping them make technology decisions? Because it's always a very fascinating area to talk about.
It's a very
Yeah,
broad
that was
question.
intentional.
Um, yeah, I get that. So, yeah, for me, it's simple. A client has a particular problem. I'm a visionary, like a ODK say that, a visionary type of person. No, no, somebody who actually looks in their brain. But that's why
Sure,
I'm
sure.
looking to the ceiling. Um, what's the word for that? Come
Visual.
on, help me. Yeah, for
You like to imagine things. Yeah,
visual
yes.
person. Yes, yes, exactly. So usually what I do is I talk with the clients. I try to understand the problem. I try to understand the circumstances of that particular situation, like what technology do they already use, what skills do they have, what is the deployment platform, how advanced is the entire development workflow, how fast put things in production. For me, of course, the de facto standard is it needs to be .NET C Sharp, maybe TypeScript and some of the front end things. And then I'm trying to use whatever I've used before. I often use indeed ChatGPT to get a sense of comparisons. I often ask people on Blue Sky or X, Twitter, like, what are your thoughts on these things? Quite often, I actually run, proofs of concepts myself just to try it, as you just said. Like, would that work? Is that like as .NET Aspire, which looks very promising? And I'm pretty sure that if I have the situation where I need to build something now, microservice C, I'm necessarily saying that we should do that. I might consider .NET Aspire, but I want to try it myself in a POC proof of concept to see how does it actually work? Is it really that smart? How do we deploy locally? How do we deploy the production? How would people work together? All these things are relevant. So I'm trying to use everything I've seen and learned, and sometimes I do that based on gut feeling, what would be the best solution for that particular client in that
Sure.
particular situation. And I could be wrong as well, by the way. That's also cool. I learned something. I think I learned it from a blog post written by Jeremy D. Miller, which talked about reversibility. Some decisions are not that important. And if you make the wrong one, you can easily switch back. The ones that actually are difficult or expensive to switch back, you have to
Sure.
spend more time on it. So I'm a person that can quickly make a decision like, okay, we're going to do this. Sounds like a good idea. Let's go for it. And if we make the wrong one, we can easily backtrack and make a decision in a different way. Look at Swashbuckle and Answag and all the stuff around open API things. Yeah, by default, I use Swashbuckle. Now I heard some rumors, so I'm asking around, like, okay, what's your experience with that? Should we actually switch to NSWAG? Is it actually worth the trouble? Stuff like that. That's also the value of having a pretty big community where you can ask these things. Oh, and by the way, um, I also like my almost continuous feed of articles. By the way, you're a good example. You also post interesting articles that you run into. I put them all in Pocket, my
Sure.
article saving tool, which I read. And sometimes I just read them. I don't do anything with them. I just put them in I always say, my mental backpack. And the next time I have to solve a particular problem, I remember like, oh, there was actually a nice solution for that. Maybe that's the proper solution,
It
if
does,
that
yeah.
makes
And I think
sense.
one like as somebody, I appreciate you kind of calling out that I post stuff. But I feel like I have to constantly be paying attention because if you don't pay attention, like snap your fingers and then like I missed something, right? Especially like in this AI
Always.
world where it's like it feels like every couple of weeks like something new comes out. Like so now the whole thing is like talking about MCP protocols, right? So it's like okay, so like that's this new
Yeah.
thing. Okay, like what do I like? What is this? And if you don't pay attention, maybe everything starts to use these technologies, and then it's only a few months, and then it's a year, and you're like, okay, maybe I'm looking for a new job, maybe I'm looking to upskill, and I don't know what the landscape is anymore. So I'm always paying attention to stuff and always trying to read and um the me just kind of aggregating posting out links that I find interesting is kind of how I do that. Like it's it's something that I've just started to do. Like every Monday I go through and I look at kind of everything that I've saved over the course of the week and I kind of skim them and look at them. And if it's interesting, I kind of schedule it to get messaged out because I think that for the most part, it's stuff that people would also find interesting, at least in my area. Um, and I
Yeah.
think
Agreed.
that's one thing that I love about community in general. Is like we're all kind of in this boat together. We're all trying to like figure out how to like stay relevant, build interesting things, not make mistakes, help other people. And I'd like to kind of transition to like what your thought of the community is. Like you talk a lot about how the community is so great. Like I'd love to get your thoughts as to you know when did you decide to become part of like the tech, or in your particular case like the .NET community, like in large.
I I still remember. I actually realized last week that the first time I started speaking in public is already 20 years ago, much longer than I thought. I started speaking about the experience I had when I realized, or when I actually discovered that a lot of developers and a lot of people, a lot of companies, at least in the Netherlands, are not using or not getting the maximum value they can get from the
Sure.
platform they're using. I discovered a lot of developers are completely fine doing their J job, doing what needs to be done, going to the office at 9, going home at 5, like,
Yep.
the 9 to 5 job. And I'm not really interested in new stuff. Maybe occasionally they go to a big conference, but what I see in a lot of my clients, that innovation is usually coming from the people that are more active in the community. And it's almost like something that reinforced itself. The fact that I'm a speaker now and I get a chance to speak at international conferences also allows me to attend that conference as an attendee and watch other people speak, which itself is already valuable because I hear so many new ideas and things, and which I again put in my
Yep.
proverbial backpack, which help me to become better at my job. Yes, I'm also on Twitter and Blue Sky, and I'm reading articles, which helps again. So I guess I'm just personally a person that likes new information. I get restless if I don't check out my
Sure.
phone
Sure.
every couple of minutes. That by itself creates all this information that I then try to process. But it's a natural thing.
Yeah.
I always did it, even before we had Twitter and everything. I just love but I have to choose. I agree also with you. There's so much, and I gave up trying to understand everything. I know for myself that I can quickly read something and put it in place. If I want to know more, I look up that article that somebody posted, or I ask somebody from the community that I happen to know that I trust they will know better, or they can give me advice on something like that. So it's almost like as soon as you're into this community thing, you almost have an infinite amount of knowledge that you can tap into. Is
Sure.
that properly the
Yeah.
expression? Yeah.
I mean, it is pretty crazy to think that at any moment you can reach out to an expert in almost anything, right? As somebody who kind of brags that I'm not an expert, like I love the fact that I know a lot about so many things, but I don't. Well, let me rephrase. I know about a lot of things. I don't know a lot about very many things. And at any point in time, I can just reach out to, you mentioned a couple of people like Jeremy Miller or like Aaron Stannard, or whoever, right? Like people that you can reach out to them directly, like, hey, I have this question about this thing. And they'll take time out of their day to talk to me about this particular thing, which I think is fascinating because they don't have to, they don't owe me anything, but they do it because they enjoy the community. They want to make sure that people are making the right choices. And
I have the same thing. And I used to ask questions on Twitter, for example, like, "Hey, you know what? I want to do this or that. What do you think is the best framework for that? Or what's your experience with that?" Now, and that's a big change. We have
yeah,
ChatGPT and tools like that that can give you a very quick summary of a lot of information that you in the past you had to digest yourself, and that changed everything. And I know it might not be completely correct, the data that you're looking at, accurate, but still, it's enough.
yeah, these tools are great, like specifically to get like quick answers, right? I think that it's then, like you mentioned, it's kind of our responsibility then to like take that next step of like, okay, like, is this information valid? Or is this information going to get us what I want? But like in my experience, if I'm asking a question about something, I usually know a little bit. So like I can kind of call out the things that are like very factually incorrect. Like
Hmm.
one thing that I use ChatGPT for constantly is like how to write bash scripts. Like write me a bash script that does like this, and it just does it for me. And I know, and I can read bash and I understand, but like I can't think of like, oh, like what's the command and what is the parameter and what is that, right? So like it helps me like write like a bash script very, very quickly. Whereas if I was to do it myself, I would have to like go and like look at like the docs for wherever the bash docs are. I don't really know where they are, but anyway, like it's one of those things where
Yeah,
it helps me kind of augment like the knowledge that I have with like more information.
yeah. I think it's basically a productivity tool. It's a very smart
Yep.
productivity tool, but it's just in the end, I'm the person that decides to use that information in a certain way. Even if you use Copilot and let it generate code, I decide how to use that. Now, even with Copilot edits, where you can edit multiple files at once by
Yep.
giving instructions, I'm still the person that accepts the change and decides whether it's the correct one. And quite often I have to manually adjust that a little bit, but that's fine. But it saves me a
Yeah.
lot of keystrokes, and that is impressive. I was actually renaming some of the unit tests and fluent assertions because I've changed my mind about how to name them the last couple of years. And yesterday I was experimenting with the new Copilot edit tool to see can I actually dump a couple of C sharp files in them and then tell Copilot to rewrite them to use to drop the when and the shoot terms and switch back to a more effect-based approach. And it was
Yeah.
pretty impressive. Not all of them were correct, but that was good enough. And then I manually fixed the
Yeah.
rest by hand. I would never be, well, it saves
Sure.
me hours
Yeah.
of time.
Like I was talking to somebody like I've never written like a Chrome extension, but I wanted like a browser extension, but I wanted to build something like I'm very big into baseball in the U.S. statistics, and I wanted to do something. So I literally was like, okay, I have this idea. I know it's also all written in JavaScript, so like I know like what I need to write, but I don't know all the structure, how to build an extension. I don't know all this stuff. So I literally go to ChatGPT. I want to build an extension that does this, 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 and this, and it literally built the entire project structure for me. It gave me a lot of code, and I'm just like, okay, well, I guess I don't really need to write much. And then I had to add the code that I wanted to add to it, but it was like like you said, it got me from like I don't have anything to I have like a minimal viable product almost immediately. Which in the past, like you have to go find a sample that does kind of what you want. You have to download that sample, make sure the sample builds, do all these sort of things, and that's work. But now I don't have to do that.
And that's logical because it's much easier to change like existing code bases, like especially if it's technology you don't know, versus starting
Yeah,
something from scratch.
and
It works the same with the whole NuGet thing that I was talking about, being able to scan NuGet packages. It produced so much code that I still need to take the
yeah,
code and refactor it, you know, change it into small methods so I can maintain it. Also, find the bugs and understand and debug it, especially because there was a lot of code from Microsoft that I was using that didn't have any documentation. I basically stepped through it and investigated, okay, what is it doing here exactly? And use my debugger to see, okay, is this an expensive method to call? Maybe I should cache those results. That's the kind of thing I would
yeah.
still do myself. But yeah, it's a good
No, it's
starter. Also, by the way, open source. I remember at my client, we were running into, I was running into some old code base that looked like it was doing some scary encryption kind of stuff, but created the code by hand. And I was looking at it and I couldn't make heads or tails of it because it was too complicated. So I asked AI assistant, because I was using
mhm.
JetBrains Rider, like, what does this code do? And it started to explain what the code did. And at the end, it was a summary saying, okay, so it looks like it's doing, what was it, RSA with
Okay.
padding, which I had no clue what is. I know RSA. So I asked the next question,
Yeah,
what is
yeah,
that?
yeah, yeah.
What does padding do? And it explains that. And I felt like, okay, so isn't there an open source library that I can use to replace this code? And damn, it actually gave me that
Yeah,
that
it's
that
crazy.
library, which I never heard of, which was very popular. That saves me like I guess a couple of
Yeah.
weeks of
No,
work.
yeah.
You know,
Again, I don't want to continually to talk how amazing these assistants are because I think that's pretty self-explanatory. But I do think that like it kind of goes hand in hand with like we talked about this kind of there's this is kind of connectivity with open source where it's like you're taking advantage of code like that you didn't 100% write yourself to like solve problems. And I kind of want to transition to back to open source a little bit because we talked about this a little bit earlier like you've created like many open source projects. Some of them have been fairly well used and you've talked about them. I'd like to get your thoughts as like when you think about like an idea And whether it's an idea that you're building something for a client or you have an idea for yourself, like when does that become like an idea that Dennis has maybe to just solve this one particular problem to like, oh, this is something that everybody else can take advantage of, I'm going to turn it into an open source project?
That's a good question. I guess for the last couple of months, I've been thinking of problems I'm trying to solve over
Yes.
and over again, or specific questions that came from clients like, hey, you know what? We don't want to upgrade to a newer version of an open source project. Is there a way to detect that, to prevent that from happening with Dependabot? That triggered my thoughts like, okay, maybe I can build something like package guard, like that's the NuGet
Yep.
package thing I talked about, because there's commercial products which are very expensive, and I don't need all the fancy features for that. I just want a tool that you can run as part of your pipeline and provide some configuration. I thought that's fun to build. For a long time, I wanted to also try out Spectre console, which is a beautiful library to create very nice command line interfaces. So I thought, okay, that could be a good
Yeah.
excuse to start using that. And then I think this weekend or something, I was implementing that, and I discovered that I was doing a lot of file directory, processing, finding certain files, and I was using path.combine in .NET a lot. And I thought, like, hey, you know what? We have this other open source project called Nuke, which I use for build pipelines, has some very neat ways to build
Hmm.
paths together, like directory path and file path. And I thought, like, hey, that is actually useful. So maybe we can extract that and make it a separate open source project that people can use.
Yeah.
Generally, when I need to use it to solve my clients' projects, and it's something that I'm creating myself again, I feel like, okay, you know what, there must be something available. And then I start using ChatGPT again. And if there's nothing available, then yeah, I mean, I have a bit more time now. And there's lots of things like Reflectify is another open source project I created, which is basically a reflection library, which is a source only package, which I extracted from Fluent Assertions because I needed it in a different place. And I thought like, hey, that's a nice little thing that will not cost me a lot of maintenance time. I also wanted to create a good example of how you can build a NuGet package that only contains source code, so you don't have the dependency hell. So I created that. And then suddenly I thought, like, hey, you know what? I've built all these open source projects. And I talked about them, like what
Yep.
you can learn from open source. There's a quite lot of patterns that I could actually build a template repository for that. So I built a .NET template repository where you can say, I want a new project. I want to build a library in .NET. And it produces the entire structure with unit test and editor config and stuff like that. Not just for other people, but also for myself, because I keep doing it over and over again.
Yeah.
That's how it works. I need it myself. I feel like, hey, this should exist. It doesn't exist. Okay, let's make it.
Yes. Yeah, I agree with everything you just said, but I wanted to first shout out, like you mentioned, Spectre Console, which, if folks don't know, is like this amazing open source project that it basically like, makes the command line more interactive and a better experience. So Patrick, shout out to our friend Patrick Svensson who wrote that. He also was one of the people who
Ah,
wrote Cake, which is build system for .NET, right?
ah,
Like so again, like there are these people that you come across that you meet them once and you're like, oh my gosh, like I've been using your stuff for your years. I feel like when I met you for the first time, I think I even said that, like I've been using Fluent Assertions for a long time, and I met you now, which is weird because it's one of those things where you put a face to all the lines of code that you've used over the time, right?
yeah,
Um,
yeah, true. Yeah,
yeah,
true.
I'd like to kind of talk about that a little bit, like and I don't want to like stroke your ego because your ego is already huge, but like when you but when you yeah,
It
sure,
takes
sure.
one to know one, huh?
When, when you have built something that is used by so many people, do you feel like there's some sort of expectation that is put upon you, or yeah, I guess that's kind of my area. It's like, do you feel like you owe something to all these people that use your stuff, or is it one of those things where like I built it for myself and then I kind of decided to share it and everybody should enjoy it kind of mutually?
No, whenever I build something, and whether it's for my clients or anywhere else, I have a very strong sense of
Yeah.
responsibility. which means I don't feel anybody of I owe anybody to anybody anything with anybody, but I do care about it. I do care, for example, that my open source projects are built
Yeah.
correctly. I do care that they have proper documentation because I guess there's also a sense of proudness, pride,
Yep.
a sense of pride in that you actually built this and want to show the world. And that's also what I tell my clients. Like I try to convince clients to also contribute to open source or make certain things open source because in my experience, it will get better because it's so in the open. The developer that feels responsible will also make sure that it's
Yeah.
done correctly. Um, so in that sense, yes, I do think it needs to be done, and I will keep doing things the correct way. You will run into people
Sure.
that are nasty, that will make very nasty comments or start challenging you about a certain direction that you take the project, or even a feature that they want that I feel like that doesn't really fit into the
Yeah.
project. And I made the mistake once by accepting a certain feature because somebody prepared a
Sure.
huge pull request, and that caused a lot of maintenance burden in the future or in the past later on. So you
Yeah.
still have to be nice. Yes, there's people that are entitled or feel entitled. They can ask, demand things, but they
Yeah.
can't. As I said, if you use open source, be prepared that at some point it might be gone or may not be available. And either you create it yourself or you accept that risk. That's what I
Yeah.
do myself. If I'm on the other side of the
I
table.
agree. Like, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, but like, whenever I've built anything, it is always a Isaac has an idea that Isaac needs to solve this problem. And then at some point, Isaac realizes, oh, other people might have the similar problem, so maybe I should share it with people. I never sit down with like a blank IDE and go, I'm going to build the next great open source project because that's silly. No one thinks like that. Um,
And nobody
exactly.
knows what it means, how
Exactly.
you
Like
actually do
you
that.
know, I haven't built anything close to the level of what you've built, but like I built Presence Light, which is it's fairly well known. It's used. It takes your team's presence and it broadcasts in the smart lights. And it's cool because uh, I built it for myself. It was during the pandemic, and I'm like, oh, like it would be great if my kids knew like not to come in the office, whether or not they pay attention to the color of the light outside the office. It doesn't matter because they came in anyway. But, enough people were like, I have that similar problem. I want this. And I got a lot of attention. And it was always funny because people would always ask me for things. And I would just simply say, like, I welcome your PR. And now it's to the point where a lot of people ask for support of different kinds of light bulbs. And I always, my canned response is always, I can't afford to buy every kind of smart light bulb. So you're more than happy
Yeah,
to, buy the light bulb yourself and put together the PR and then show me evidence of it working and I'll merge it. I don't care. But it's one of those things where some person years ago like got kind of upset. They're like, "It's the light bulb's $10." And I said, "Okay. Are you you want my mailing address? Do you want to mail it to me?" So it's just one of those things where to your point, like some people are just kind of nasty where there's this entitlement. And I want to kind of transition the conversation to that. It's like how do you deal with that, like you mentioned, like you merged in a really big PR, like and that kind of I don't say it's burned you or it kind of like made it harder for you. Like how do you manage people that want to contribute to your work, right? Because at the end of the day, like people are going to come in, they're going to do their PR, and then more than likely you'll never engage with them again. So how do you manage that
correct.
thing where any code that you commit to the main of your branch is something that you, Dennis, have to live with the rest of that project's life?
Correct. Yes, that's what it is. Even it's a beautiful pull request if it's created by somebody else. I am the person that ultimately or eventually have to maintain it. I have to
Yeah.
understand that. And that's a responsibility I'm willing to take when I merge it. That's also why I often, and especially on the bigger project like Fruit Assertions, we had like
Yep.
contribution guidelines. We streamlined the whole process. Like, don't even create a pull request. First, create an issue where you propose something, where we can discuss it. Does it make sense? All the other open source projects don't have that yet. But as soon as I get the feeling that we have to streamline it, actually, that way, I now use also my clients to start
Yeah.
promoting inner sourcing, where you have the same problems. You don't want people to randomly deliver a pull
Sure,
request to a
sure.
different team and saying, I've created this feature. Can you please review it? But hold on. We haven't actually discussed it. Let's first discuss what you want. Maybe it's a niche feature. Maybe we can support it using extension point. Same principles apply to an open source project. You need to streamline that process. Otherwise, you get hijacked. Your time gets
Yeah.
hijacked. Because that's also the flip side. If your project is big enough, you actually spend a majority of your time code reviewing other people's pull requests. And you don't want that either. You still want to build your own
Yeah,
features. So you have to find that balance and
you
streamline
bring
that
up a very
process a
interesting
bit.
point, and I kind of want to like switch to that really quick, like the idea of inner source, especially when you're working with customers and you're an external person as a contractor or a consultant or whatever. You come in and you say, you're probably building something that some other team has already built, or I know for a fact this other team has built. How do those conversations typically
Yeah.
go? Because I remember, I like my first job. I remember it was very much just like we had a team that built a lot of stuff, and they would just share DLLs out on shares. And it was like, oh, you go and you consume
Yeah.
that DLL, and that has like logging or that has like this particular thing or whatever. And that's kind of how we like did inner sourcing. Obviously, it's substantially better now. But I'm curious, like, what it is it depending like does it vary by the customer? Like, how is inner sourcing kind of how do people react to it inside companies when it's first introduced to them? That's the
Well,
best way. Yeah,
um, I don't know actually, because we've used
yeah,
it in many companies, but what you generally see is a company that's already using
sure,
GitHub for their source control. They feel more comfortable with the idea, but like clients that use Azure DevOps, they where everything is locked down, one team cannot actually
yeah. If
access
it's
the
in
code
different
of the other.
organizations or different
They don't
projects,
get that.
sure,
They
yeah,
have
yeah,
to see that. Yeah, exactly. So I usually try to show them what you can do, for example, with GitHub. So for me, GitHub is not just a fancier source control system. It's actually an enabler to make that, contributing and collaborating
sure,
much easier because you can fork without you needing to have specific rights, whereas forks is not properly implemented. So for me, I usually start this whole, yeah, train of improvements and thought processes and discussions and demonstrations how that can work, because quite often it's like, okay, we want to use that component from team X, used by team Y, but team X doesn't have time
hmm
to make that new feature, so you're stuck. You get this, all these projects that have then dependencies and timelines. As soon as you make it easier to support that, because if you say, yeah, but why can't the other team do that? Yeah, but how do they do that? Do
yeah,
they create a pull request or something like that? Are you going to review it? You still
sure,
need some owners, but by making it easier, having a build pipeline, having tools that automatically format the code, having agreements, how you actually propose an idea, literally what I do on my own projects. If you show that to people, they feel like, okay, this could actually work. And it should work because it works in the open source world. Why wouldn't it work internally?
yeah,
And by the way, one extra thing I usually tell them, like if a company is bigger, let's say more than 50 developers, quite often developers do not know
yeah,
each other
yeah,
anymore. By adopting inner sourcing and using tools which have a social element like GitHub, you actually will discover that people will discover each other. They will see like, hey, who's this dude or who's this girl that actually created this pull request? Oh, this person is actually in
yeah,
that department. I didn't know him or her. Or, we should probably talk about this a little bit more. It actually creates, connections within the
yeah.
company on the social level, and I really saw that
Yeah, no,
happening.
I mean, I think inner source is a great way to like break down silos because I mean, let's face it, like every company, like you said, that has more than like 20 developers, silos get developed, right? Here's a random
Yeah.
question, and it could just be a very short answer. Like, have you ever had a customer that like said no to inner source? Like, I don't care what other teams are building, we're gonna build it the way we want to build it. No,
No,
no.
never,
Yeah. I
never.
like I've worked at companies in the past where like we had evidence of like a team building something similar and instead decided to build it ourselves because of whatever reason, politics or whatever. It's like and I always thought that was kind of funny. I remember that a lot. It's like why would we build the same thing twice? Just because like maybe someday somebody will say it's one's better than the other? Like who cares, right?
It's
Yeah.
an approach. Sometimes you have to build multiple versions, but it could also be
Yeah.
organizational constraints. Like the people that are building their own version report to different managers who have their own budget and do not even want to have people work together because it creates complicated discussions like, okay,
Yeah.
who's going to pay for that? Um, that is something you need to change to make be able to possible. You can still do
Yeah.
it on the low level without telling your manager and actually showing how people are working together. Could also because they don't want to move to the GitHub and they want to stick with Azure DevOps because that's the way we do it. There can be many reasons for that, but yeah, that's also why I typically join a client for a couple of years to really try to change that. You cannot just change the tool; you have to change the
Yeah.
entire mindset and make
I,
everything possible. Make sure that your infrastructure facilitates this
I mean,
process.
you're kind of describing like DevOps, right? Like I think, and this is a complete different tangent that we don't have time for, but I've always said that like the tools and the technology is the easy part of DevOps. Like it's getting all the teams to work together, it's getting teams to be structured differently, it's changing the culture. That is challenging about DevOps. That is what's hard. Like
Yeah,
implementing
yeah,
tool
yeah,
X to do like continuous integration and continuous delivery, like that's easy. That's super easy. Like, and I'm oversimplifying, like it could be hard, but in the grand scheme of things, like changing technology is substantially easier than changing people because people are
correct.
annoying, like how much they do not want to change, right? Yeah.
I agree.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I completely
And
agree.
so and one of the things I'd like as we start to wrap up is, I'd like to kind of talk about, you know, open source in your opinion and how you go forward, right? Like we talked about like you build like large things, you're currently building something new. We're in this world right now where it feels like any idea you have, there's an open source project for. And the idea, and some of them cost money, some of them are free and they cost money, some of them completely cost money. And I'm curious as to like your thought, like what is the happy medium for like when you're building a project and it's like, you know, my time is valuable. I don't want to do all of my
Yeah,
work for free, but I understand that that is going to bring the best benefit to the community if it is 100% free and it has a very accessible license. But I'd like to get your thoughts. It's like, what is the happy medium? Because last time I checked, Dennis, you don't work for free. So like, how do you think about these things?
true. Well, I have a pretty good
Sure.
job as a consultant, and the thing is, I enjoy building these
Yeah.
things,
That's what's so hard.
and
That's
it
what's so
gives me
hard
so
is like you
much.
enjoy doing it, but you don't have free hours. You don't have free hours in your life to just build things you enjoy. You have responsibilities, right?
No,
Yep.
I have to choose. I literally have to choose. I know that like the next couple of weeks, I'm now going to finish the first version of this package scanning thing. And if that's done, I'm planning to create another feature for Fluent Assertions 8, which I have on my list. And right after that, I'm planning to add a small feature to I basically have for myself a backlog. But to be honest, I also want to do some gaming. I just bought Star Wars
Oh,
Outlaws, and I sometimes have a streak of
yeah.
time where I play games. I just finished another game. What was it, Indiana Jones? I have to choose. Some nights I just don't have the energy to program, and I'm going to sit on the couch with my wife and watch some stupid
Yeah.
sitcom or something like that, or a movie with my son. I'm trying to balance these things, and by the way, I'm also the treasurer of my kids' handball club, so I'm
Yeah.
trying to balance time. But yeah, I just enjoy
I
it,
mean,
and it
yeah.
gives me
And that's
something.
what's so great about it is that like, I've always said I'm a very selfish person. Like anybody who like actually knows me knows that I'm a pretty selfish person in general. I love to do things for other people, but it's all about me. Like I do things for other people so I can feel good about it, right? I don't do selfless acts. I do things for me that happen to make other people's lives better. So if I'm building something, right? It's really like, okay, well I'm building this to make my life better, and if other people take advantage of it, good for them. That's great. And that goes back to like the balance thing where it's like sometimes I get so caught up in like wanting to do like get something that's going to make my life a bit better that like I'll just tune out of everything else. And one of the reason why I bring that up is I have a question. It's like, you know, like what do you think that they're like, because there's people out there that do lots and lots of open source and they're always building stuff. I would even bracket you into that category. Like what is healthy? Like the amount of open source that you build, knowing that like you're going to get people that are sometimes not nice to you. You're probably not going to get enough credit. People are going to want to argue about decisions that you make. Like when is it and is not worth it? And like what is the balance there?
Yeah, I guess that when you feel anxious or feel a certain pressure that you have to do something, it becomes too much. Like, to be fair, like when we decided to commercialize fluent assertions aid for commercial companies, not for open source project, but commercial companies, there was a lot of
Sure.
backlash. People created even videos about that. And I was like, oh crap, what did I do?
Sure.
Was it a mistake? Why did I do it? Because it was not like I did it because there was an opportunity that I couldn't say no to. Um, but it felt like, oh, it was actually getting under my skin
Sure.
for a couple of weeks, which I
Because it's
never
your, well,
expected.
it's
And that
your,
actually,
I mean, not to make it so like grand, but it is your life. You've committed like time of your life to it, right? Yeah.
15 years I spent on this. 15 years, and I spent still 5 to 10 hours a week on open source. It's a lot of time. But after a while, I realized, okay, there's always going to be people that don't like that particular situation. There's always people that will, no, I'll say bitch about it, but I can't say that, that never contributed to any of these projects. They just come off the blue and
Sure.
started to complain about that. Um, and I kind of, at some point, realized, and by the way, the project actually, the number of downloads per day
Sure.
only
Sure.
increased since then. So I felt like, okay, you know what? Who
Yeah.
cares? It's still being used, and as long as it's being used, and then I'll keep investing in it because I
Yeah.
enjoy working on it. I literally spent 3 weeks fixing a very difficult bug, which I really wanted to fix because I'm a completionist. I also play all my games until I finish all the
Sure.
side quests. I really wanted to fix that bug, and it cost you a lot of time. And yeah, I was committed to do that
Yeah.
because I enjoy it. If I have the feeling somebody's not using my open source project anymore, that's the point where I probably
Mm,
say, okay, you know, then there's probably a better alternative, and
yeah.
I'll start using that.
Yeah. And I think,
But as long and it gives you, yeah, it
well,
gives you
yeah, I
so
think
much.
it's
That's the
also,
thing.
it's a very healthy way to think
Recogn
about it too. Like, if you're okay, like these things do take time to build. And you do have like some sort of like weird relationship with it, like a familial relationship, like it's my kid or whatever. But at the end of the day, I think I'm similar to you, where it's like, if it doesn't bring value anymore to me and or to anybody else, it doesn't need to exist, right? Like, and
yeah,
that's, it's
yeah,
okay. It's okay. Um,
yeah. Unless I don't
sure.
have the energy anymore, but yeah, for now,
You have limitless
I do
energy,
that.
Dennis. You
I
have
still
limitless
have it.
energy. Like, you're always building something really cool. I looked at your GitHub the other day and I was like, man, Dennis is building stuff all the time. Um, which, I get imposter syndrome because I'm like, oh, maybe I should build as much as Dennis, and then I realize like, oh, okay, well, maybe I'm not as good as a developer as Dennis, and then I do that whole spiral. Um, but this has been a great conversation, and I've really appreciated like hearing your thoughts on open source and tech. And I'd like to kind of, as we finish, I'd like to kind of hear like your thoughts, like what the future is. We talked a lot about AI, we talked a lot about like developer activity, we talked a lot about like open source and how to manage it. Like if you were to kind of, obviously you can't because you'd be a billionaire if you knew what the future was. But what do you think in the next 18 months, like the life of a developer is going to be like? Like in general, what do you think it's going to be like?
Honestly, I don't think it will change that much. It's just that AI
Sure.
will just get bigger. There's more features, there's more capabilities. We have AI everywhere. And for me, it was, as I said, I used it
Yeah.
as a productivity tool. Only recently, I think maybe even at the MVP summit last week, I saw some demos how you can actually use it in .NET, and it was
Sure.
surprisingly easy. So for me, it's just one of the tools that I have to my disposal, no, that I have to be able to build solutions. Um, 18 months, yeah. In the .NET space, I guess
Sure.
Aspire is going to be bigger. It's going to make a difference. For the rest, it's just
Yeah.
going to go on. Tools will be faster. AI will be much more broadly used. That's
Yeah.
definitely going to happen. But it's not going to replace anybody except maybe people that never
Yeah.
programmed and suddenly can produce
Yeah.
applications. But for the rest of us, it's just stuff that we can use. Makes
Yeah.
our life better.
Yeah. And I totally agree. I think also like it's one of those things where you'll realize that there are things that you thought that you couldn't do that you can do now, which it's about empowering people, which I think is really important. A lot of people think that
Exactly.
this stuff
Yeah.
is just going to replace work, It's like, yeah, it's going to replace work you don't want to do. And it's going to give you the opportunity to do things like,
Indeed.
build something in a language or with a framework that you've never touched before. And you can get working on it within an hour instead of having to like read a bunch of docs and everything.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, that's what it is. It's a very smart Google.
yeah.
You don't have to scan all the documentation yourself, or Bing if you want to. Being able to scan everything yourself and figure it out, and now you just get something that you can start it with and
Yeah.
understand and refine. Whatever language you do, I've used it to understand PL SQL, Oracle, stuff like that, PHP. It's
Yeah.
just
I,
possible.
I, I honestly, the two things that I use these AI tools for the most is how to write bash scripts and how to write link statements. That's it. I swear. I don't know how to do I can never put together like a good group buy with link, so I always need like a little bit of help. And like I just like whenever I see it, it's chef's kiss. It makes me feel so good about myself. Um and this has been great. Like Dennis, it's always good to chat with you. Obviously because you're just a good person to chat with, but you have all this knowledge and all this background in these things that I find interesting as well as you do. And for folks that aren't following Dennis, I highly recommend you do. The best way you can find them is on social media, like for instance on Blue Sky, at dennisdoman.com. Did I pronounce your last name right? Yeah, there we
Yeah,
go.
yeah,
And there'll be some
correct.
show links in the show notes to some of the places you can find him, like GitHub and Twitter and LinkedIn and all that sort of stuff. Before we sign off, my friend, do you have any parting words?
The
Oh
future is
man,
bright
oh man, I f-
for
yeah,
developers, especially for
yeah.
.NET developers. It's
Yeah.
going to be
No,
awesome.
I agree. And
It,
I'm very I honestly like similar to what you were saying earlier, like I might be a bit naive. I haven't spent a ton of time in other developer communities, but I'm very grateful for the fact that I'm in this community because I've gotten the opportunity to learn great things, build some great things, meet great people like you. And it's all because of me just happening to like my first real job in tech was .net. And yeah, this has been great. And I want to thank you so much for being on the show today. And I want to thank the people that are watching this live and the folks that are listening at this in the future. So, for my friend Dennis Doman, my name is Isaac Levin. This has been Coffee and Open Source, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.